today is sort of a continuation of that. As we set the stage, we get a good detailed look at the character in particular of Daniel and his three buddies that we knew better as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they got renamed after getting taken into Babylonian captivity. But Daniel, of course, stands out as not just the one who is the author of this particular book, but he is the one who is the spokesperson, and God grants him special privilege, special ability to interpret dreams and visions, and much of what we're going to see throughout the remainder of the book of Daniel after today will have a lot to do with that. And so that's where we'll get the tie-in with the prophecy that we studied for those that were with us throughout our study of the book of Revelation. Many of the things that we referenced and many of the things that we studied in the book of Revelation will have connections back to Daniel's prophecies, and we'll get into that. But today we continue this idea that Daniel is an example to us as Christ followers, as godly individuals. We see the example, and we ought to, as the old song goes, dare to be a Daniel. Dare to be a Daniel. Make the determination within our hearts and minds to be as dedicated to the cause of the Lord Jesus Christ as Daniel was dedicated to the cause of his God in very difficult times. Now remember, Daniel was about a 14, 15-year-old boy. He and his three buddies that we read about, they were taken captive primarily because their homeland in the southern kingdom of Israel, what was called Judah, all of Israel had eventually collapsed under their disobedience. God had allowed them to suffer judgment at the hands of these ungodly rulers and kings, first of the Assyrians in the northern kingdom, and then the Babylonians were actually a branch off of the Assyrians who had come to even greater power, who came to eventually take over the southern kingdom. And they started taking some of the people with them. And it took about 3 different installments, but the first go around, they start looking for the people from noble families, important families, who have sons that are young, vibrant, smart, who are going to be good, strong leaders. And they were going to take them, remember in chapter 1, they were going to take them, put them through a 3-year program and teach them the ways of the Babylonians. And they were going to instruct them in all these different ways. And Daniel and his associates, there were many of them, but we just get an up-close look at Daniel and the 3 young men that we came to know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we'll get to see them again later on in this book. But they stand out as young men who decided, wait a minute, we can listen to your instruction and your education on literature because we know the truth about God. We've been well instructed about that. So it's like I can go to public school and I can go to public university under you guys, but I'm not buying everything you're selling, but I can listen to it and I'll know more about the culture that I'm living in. And you can change our names and call us different names outwardly. That doesn't change who we are on the inside. But when it comes to eating the king's food, that's a bridge too far. We're not going down that road. We're not making that next step because that has been told to us and instructed to us by our God that we are not to defile ourselves or to dirty ourselves up by doing things that everybody else does. God has instructed the Israelites, the people of the Jewish ethnicity, if they were going to be faithful to Yahweh God, the one true God, they were not to participate in all the social activities. And one of those things was to not eat all the things that everybody else ate. Okay? That was supposed to be a dividing line whereby God's people stood out. And so Daniel said, look, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but when you tell us we've got to do this, That's not something we're willing to do. We want permission to survive on simply vegetables and water. We don't want to do what everybody else is doing. We don't want to eat the food that's been sacrificed to idols, and we don't want to drink the wine, because we're not going to defile ourselves with that food that has been forbidden by our God. And even though the wine's not forbidden, we're not going to take a chance of anybody thinking that we're drunk. We're not going to even take a risk of being intoxicated. And so Daniel convinces the leadership eventually to let them test it out. He has to put feet to his faith. He believes that God will allow them to look strong and healthy, even though they're not eating everything that the king had ordered all these captives to eat. And you know the story. Even if you weren't here last week, you probably know the story. It worked out because they were faithful to God. God granted them favor in the eyes of these heathen men who had no reason to work with them, but God granted favor in those people's eyes. And we saw several key characteristics of a Daniel, of someone of this high character that wants to honor God. We talked about his boldness. We talked about the standard that he chose to live by that was above the minimum. We saw that God granted him favor. He was persistent through it all. He didn't give up when they immediately started to push back against it. He looked for another way, and God granted blessing in that direction. His faith was unwavering through the tough times. He had to live it out. He endured the testing, and then God blessed him. At the end of chapter 1, we saw God made it so that these guys were smarter than everybody else. And even Daniel got an extra measure of God's blessing in that he had special knowledge about dreams and visions. And that's going to come in real handy in chapter 2. And as a result, even the heathen king named Nebuchadnezzar, who was not a godly man, he was a wise and intelligent individual, but not in the things of God. He noticed that Daniel and these three guys, they're like 10 times wiser than the regular guys. Even the regular wise guys can't measure up to them. So for boys that had gone through this 3-year program who are somewhere in the range of 17, 18 years old, it's noteworthy at the end of chapter 1 that the king notices that they are a cut above. All right? Yeah, he doesn't really know how devoted they are to their God. But he knows they're really smart, and that's what really matters to him, because kings needed to have smart people underneath them so that they could continue to look smart in front of all the people. And he knew that. And so he kept that in mind, and I believe that's going to come into play very importantly here in chapter 2. Now, chapter 2 is a narrative in that it tells a story and it moves pretty free-flowing. So let's take a look at, in particular, let's look at the first 13 verses and take a look at the story, how it gets set up, and then we're going to see some more of Daniel's character beginning in verse 14. But beginning in verse 1, we see King Nebuchadnezzar is having a dream, and that ought to be a signal right away that Daniel's going to get involved after we've been told about his special ability concerning dreams. Daniel chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, says, "One night during the 2nd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had such disturbing dreams that he couldn't sleep." As a quick aside, so that we don't get sidetracked or messed up, Daniel and his buddies have completed the 3-year program. It says it's the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, the way they measured the years of their reign, his first year wouldn't start until the new calendar year had started. So when Nebuchadnezzar's father had passed away and he ascended to the throne, if that happens in January or February, or if it happens in November, it doesn't matter. That whole first calendar year, or that first set of months that finish out that year doesn't count as his first year. So his first year was the leftover portion of his dad's reign, right? Daniel and the guys had already started their 3-year program during that time. Then the first year, now the second year was actually the 3rd year that Daniel and the boys had been in Babylon. So don't get derailed there. The timeline still works. By the way they measured it, this was the 2nd full year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. He had already started bringing in these captives for training, and they had completed their 3 years. We'll see that by evidence in a little bit. Now in verse 2, he's got disturbing dreams. That's plural. Multiple dreams had disturbed him. So what does he do in verse 2? He called in his magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers. And he demanded that they tell him what he had dreamed. Okay? So all these supposed wise men, all these men who used everything in nature besides the God who had created all of nature, they used everything they could find in nature to find answers without consulting the God of nature, the God of the heavens. They looked to the stars. They would, in today's world, they would be using horoscopes, Ouija boards, and tarot cards. Anything and everything they could find, anything that they could drum up, any sort of magic or hocus pocus activity that would allow them to eventually come through and say, this is what will happen next. Obviously, nobody is perfectly able to predict the future. But they made a living on predicting the future to some level of accuracy, because honestly, a lot of this stuff, you can be real generic and get sort of right on it. It's always been true. But the kings in that day and time didn't worship the one true God, so this was essentially their religion so that they could seem smart. And down through the years, these men had taken a lot of notes. And when somebody had a dream, then they watched after, what was that dream? Okay, we're going to write down your dream. And they had books that were probably numbered. And dream number 282 was this. And what happened to that man in the months that followed that dream? Well, that was the interpretation that they concluded. If he died 6 weeks later, then this dream means you're going to die. They had all these books and records that they kept, and they would go back and consult them, and so they would take somebody's dream, and they would find something similar that matched up, and then they would look at what they had recorded and what had happened to people after they had had a dream similar to that, and then they came up with their prediction. And I don't know how often people really followed up on them and said, you know, you predicted this, and it didn't happen that way. For whatever reason, they had such status in the community that whatever they said would happen, people tended to believe it. And I don't know how often they got followed up on, but I suspect as we read this, follow with me as you will, I think Nebuchadnezzar was on to them. He's not a godly man by any means, but he's intelligent. And I think he had come to realize, even in his short life at that point, these guys aren't right all the time. And they're supposed to be the smartest people in the community. They're not right all the time. Maybe the voices that we listen to who claim to be experts aren't really experts. Has anything changed under the sun? I say not. Verse 3. Okay, so as they stood before the king, verse 3, this is what the king said. I have had a dream. So now he's narrowed it down from multiple dreams to just this one. I have had a dream that deeply troubles me, and I must know what it means. Okay, boys, here it is. I've had a tough dream. It's bothering me. I need to know what the story is behind it. What's the meaning? That's what they were good at. They weren't so good at the next thing. So you get the dream, but now here comes the dilemma. Verse 4 and following. Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, "Long live the king." Always a good idea to say you want the king to live a long time. Live long and prosper, king. We love you. Okay? Always start with that. Why? Because you know you're a liar, right? They know they're liars, but they're professional liars. So they got to set it up. Tell us the dream, and we will tell you what it means. Pretty simple and straightforward. This doesn't sound like it's going to be any sort of problem for them. Verse 5. That first word in verse 5. But the king said to the astrologers, "I am serious about this. If you don't tell me what my dream was and what it means, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be turned into heaps of rubble." So that was a fairly common thing when somebody had dishonored themselves to the point that they were going to be put to death. They tended to chop them up into pieces. They didn't just gently kill them off. And then they would take their property in their home and turn it into a new city dump. It would be the dung pile for the community. So boys, here's the deal. You got to tell me what the dream was and what it means, or else it's all over for you. Okay, well, that's a bit much. And we can argue whether or not the king had actually, there's some who believe that the king had actually, God had allowed him to forget it. There are others who would say, well, it seems to be that the king knew, but he was holding back. I don't think that really matters. The point is, they were going to be proven to be the frauds that they really were. They claimed they could read everything in the heavens and tell the future, and that they had all kinds of knowledge, and the fact is, it was all a farce, it was all a joke. They were liars and frauds, and they were going to be proven to be such. Verse number 6. But if you tell me, okay, I told you what will happen if you can't do it, but if you tell me what I dreamed and what the dream means, I will give you many wonderful gifts and honors. Just tell me the dream and what it means. So he's made it pretty clear what he wants, right? He's already said it twice now. You're going to have to tell me what the dream is and what it means. Verse 7, just like anybody else who hears what they want to hear, they said again in verse 7, "Please, your majesty, tell us the dream." Now he just told them twice that you have to tell him the dream. But they know that they can't do that, so now they're getting very humble and they're saying, "Please, just tell us the dream, and we will tell you what it means." Verse 8, the king replied, "I know what you're doing." And this is where I think he was on to them. He was wise to the fact that these guys weren't really as smart as they claimed to be. Nebuchadnezzar, even as an ungodly man, had a suspicion that average humans can't figure this stuff out. And he's calling them on it. "I know what you're doing. You're stalling for time because you know I am serious when I say," verse 9, "that if you don't tell me the dream, you are doomed. So you have conspired to tell me lies." I think he's talking about, for years you guys have been lying to me. You've always carried each other's water. You've always worked off one another. You sort of started the lie, and then another one of you would carry the lie on, and all of you knew that what you were telling me was completely false, but you told it to me anyway because you were trying to save your skin. He said, "So you have conspired to tell me lies, hoping I would change my mind. But tell me the dream, and then I'll know that you can tell me what it means. Why would I believe your interpretation? See, you guys tell me interpretations on stuff all the time, and I've learned that you don't always get it right. So why should I believe that you know the interpretation if you can't even tell me what the dream was? So he's wise to them. And so now the deficiency of mankind gets put on display. Even these wise guys have to admit some things here. The astrologers replied to the king in verse 10, "No one on earth can tell the king his dream." That's the first thing they said that was correct. Now they're telling truth. Under pressure, they're forced to admit the truth. The truth is, nobody can do what you're telling us to do. He says, and no king, however great and powerful, has ever asked such a thing of any magician, enchanter, or astrologer. Not only are you asking us to do something that's impossible, but kings don't do this to their wise men. You're out of line, basically. In the kindest way possible, I need to say to you, you're out of line. That's not something that you should be asking us to do. And he goes on in verse 11, the spokesman of the astrologers apparently says, the king's demand is impossible. No one except the gods. Okay, so they're getting close to being right again, right? They know that a human can't figure it out. They're claiming that some gods, lowercase g gods out there might be able to know it, but regular humans can't figure this out. No one except the gods can tell you your dream, and, well, the gods, they do not live here among people. So, until you tell us the dream, we're not going to get anywhere with this, king. Well, the problem with that is the king did not take that answer and accept it. That was not an acceptable response. So verses 12 and 13, we see the king was furious when he heard this. Now it's time to issue a decree. When he heard this, he ordered that all the wise men of Babylon be executed. Now, he was a fairly intelligent man, but he wasn't without his faults. Clearly, he had a pretty quick temper, and he was willing to issue a decree that didn't have much foresight. Like, okay, so if I kill all the wise men, then I don't have any more wise men. Now, maybe he thought that was a good thing. Maybe it was time to just rule as king without the help of any wise men. But he hadn't considered the possibility or the reality that if he killed them all, there literally wouldn't be any more wise men. But again, maybe that's what he wanted. And so verse 13, because of the king's decree, men were sent to find and kill Daniel and his friends. Daniel and his friends were counted as the understudies or the apprentices of these wise men, and so guilty by association. Okay? The lead, the oldest and most advanced astrologers and wise men, they went before the king. Daniel and the boys probably weren't even in the room, and by association, everybody that was considered among the wise men in the king's court, everybody got the order of execution upon their head. So, without having done anything wrong, without having failed at all, Daniel and his cohorts, these 17, 18-year-old young men who had proven to be really intelligent, they're under the order of execution as well. And now we get to walk through Daniel's part in this. We're not going to get the interpretation of the dream today, all right? So bear with me. But we're going to see how Daniel staves off execution for himself and all the other wise men. and he gets a position and an opportunity before the king that sets in motion the incredible unveiling of God's prophetic message. And I just think it's interesting that God gives his prophetic message through the dreams of an ungodly king. God can and will use even leaders who are ungodly to bring his purposes to pass. Don't ever doubt God's ability to bring about his purposes, even in the midst of ungodly leaders. So we're going to see here in verses 14 and following what a godly response to crisis looks like. Okay? What are some of the characteristics that Daniel shows that any follower of Christ should be ready to demonstrate in times of crisis? Honoring God and representing Christ well in the good times, that ain't that hard. But in times of crisis, do these characteristics shine through as they should? Let's look first of all in verse 14, and we're going to see that Daniel has great composure. Daniel has great composure. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, that was his lead executioner guy, when Arioch came to kill them, Daniel handled the situation with wisdom and discretion. Daniel remained calm. He had composure, even though his life was on the line. Literally, it was a matter of life and death. And then now verses 15 and 16. He asked Arioch. Now again, I believe you're going to see God is working through Arioch, who's not a godly man, just as God had worked through the previous leaders in their captivity that had allowed them to eat the vegetables and drink the water. He asked Arioch. Arioch could have just told him, just shut up, I'm not listening to anything from you. You've been ordered to be executed. But by the grace of God, the favor of God, Daniel's able to ask a question. Why has the king issued such a harsh decree? And again, instead of telling Daniel, it's none of your business, God grants favor in this moment because Daniel's being obedient and he's being composed and courageous. Arioch told him all that had happened. So maybe he sat down and said, let me tell you how we got to this point, Daniel. And Daniel's radar goes off. And he's like, wait a minute, a dream? That's my area. God has blessed me to understand dreams. It's time for me to do what God has gifted me to do. And so there's some unwritten stuff here that you can understand in these verses that follow. Daniel has remained under control and composed. Secondly, now here in verse 16, we're going to see that he has courage to act on it. Daniel went at once. Somehow, some way, Arioch let Daniel go see the king. He was supposed to kill him and the three boys, the three buddies, and instead, after a quick talk, Daniel gets permission to go see the king one-on-one. Daniel went at once to see the king, and he requested more time to tell the king what the dream meant. Now, the other guys had basically said the same thing. Tell us what the dream is, we'll figure it out, give us some time. He didn't have any time or any patience for those other wise men. But Daniel's courage, I believe Daniel's confidence made an impression on Arioch, made an impression on the king. We don't get told anything here. He went to the king, he asked for more time. Evidently, he was granted more time. The king must have been impressed by Daniel's confidence, his composure. He must have been impressed that he is one of the smart ones. I noticed that he was smarter than the rest of them. And Daniel is flatly saying, I can and will be able to tell you. And maybe the king goes, well, all the rest of the guys said it's impossible, but this guy thinks it can happen. So he gives him time. Again, God working through an ungodly man to allow time to bring forth what God wanted to bring forth. Now we keep moving in verse 17. We see that Daniel didn't just come up with an idea on his own. The king gave him some time. Daniel is now a man who not only has composure and confidence and courage, but he is a prayerful man. Prayerfulness. Verse 17. Then Daniel went home and told his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We end up knowing them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He told his friends what had happened. And look what he does in verse 18. He urged them to ask the God of heaven to show them his mercy by telling them the secret so they would not be executed along with the other wise men of Babylon. Now, yeah, okay, self-preservation was part of the deal. They don't want to die. But they also want the God of heaven to be put on display. And so their prayerfulness, they didn't go get all the books and the records and say, well, let's look this one up and see which one we think it matches up with or which one we think the king is thinking of. They prayed about it. And then look what happens in verse 19. That night the secret was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then what does Daniel do? After being prayerful, now he's going to be thankful. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven. And we get a set of verses here that are essentially a psalm of Daniel's, beginning in verse 20. Daniel said, praise the name of God forever and ever, for he has all wisdom and power. He controls the courses of the world events. He removes kings and sets up other kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the scholars. He reveals deep and mysterious things and knows what lies hidden in darkness, though he is surrounded by light. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors, for you have given me wisdom and strength. You have told me what we asked of you and revealed to us what the king demanded. So he was very much mindful of his need to give thanks. So you got a man who has demonstrated composure when his life was on the line. You got a man who has demonstrated courage by asking permission to go talk to the king and to ask the king for time which he wasn't giving to anybody else. But then he was prayerful in order to seek God in his direction. And then when God gave him direction, he didn't forget that it came from God. And so he was thankful. Now look what the outpouring of that leads to. Now I've got the answer. Now I have spent the rest of the night praising God. Now I get to go take credit in front of the king, right? Not quite. Verse 24, then Daniel went in to see Arioch. He went back to see the head executioner, whom the king had ordered to execute the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel said to him, don't kill the wise men. Take me to the king, and I will tell him the meaning of his dream. So Daniel had compassion. After God had granted him the answer, and after he had given God thanks, his immediate response was to have compassion. I got to make sure that Arioch and the rest of those guys haven't gotten impatient and started to kill these people. I'm going to go show compassion for them and say, don't do it. Make sure that nobody gets injured, much less killed. I'm going to go tell the king. what he wanted to know. And so here we go, verse 25. Arioch quickly took Daniel to the king and said, I have found one of the captives from Judah who will tell the king the meaning of his dream. Arioch has to take a little credit for it, right? I have found him. Really? Okay. And again, it's like he just saw Daniel. The king just saw Daniel. But nevertheless, Arioch needs to take credit for it. So I got him, king. I found one for you. Verse 26, the king said to Daniel, who was also known as Belteshazzar, is this true? Can you tell me what my dream was and what it means? And now we see Daniel has some strong conviction. Yeah, he's going to tell him. But he's going to give a little lead up to it. Verse 27, Daniel replied, there are no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or fortune tellers who can reveal the king's secret. Just so you haven't forgotten, this is not something that comes from smart human beings. There's not one who can do this, king. Okay? So just a reminder, all those guys really are the phonies that you thought they were. Verse 28, here's what you need to know. I'm going to say this with conviction. But there is a God in heaven. Capital G God in heaven. Who reveals secrets, and he has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the future. Now I will tell you your dream and the visions you saw as you lay on your bed. Verse 29 is the opening statement. While your majesty was sleeping, you dreamed about coming events. He who reveals secrets, that's a name for God. He's the God who reveals secrets, has shown you what is going to happen. Oh, and by the way, Daniel has to add here, and we'll close with a statement of his humility. It is not because I am wiser than anyone else that I know the secret of your dream. King, don't make the mistake of believing that I'm the one you ought to worship. It is not because I'm wiser, but it's because God wants you to understand what was in your heart. It's because God wants you to have this information. And next week we'll get into Daniel's interpretation, his revealing of the dream and his interpretation about future events. But let me close with a recap. God's people in a time of crisis now, the type of people that God can actually work through. We have to be people that have a level of composure. We have to be able to maintain composure in difficult times. And it's sort of an ebb and a flow. The composure might tamp us down, but then our courage has to rise up, right? We have to be courageous enough to speak when time arrives to speak. But we must not do it hastily or recklessly. We have to be people that are prayerful. There has to be an element of prayerfulness in times of crisis. And when God gives us a sense of direction or an answer of some sort, we must also then demonstrate our thankfulness and remember where our help came from. And then finally, I would say from Daniel we could learn that a godly person in time of crisis is going to show compassion. What did Daniel know about all those magicians, astrologers, and enchanters? That they didn't know the one God, the one true God. And so he didn't want them to die just yet. Perhaps they might come to faith. And so he had compassion on them. But when it came time to speak directly to the king and to tell him something, he showed conviction. I want you to know no other human can figure this out, and I want you to know this came from the God of heaven. And his humility will always need to remind people that I don't deserve the credit, God does. And that's who God calls us to be. We're going to have a time of communion